the terms of the agreement from the brief overview summary that we've seen so far are very incomplete and potentially quite far-reaching. So it's still vague, but what it does tell us is that the intention for both China and the Prime Minister of the Solomons, Sogavare, to escalate the nature of their political, military and security cooperation is still very real, very positive. The only caveat that we've yet heard is from the Foreign Affairs Minister of Australia, Marise Payne, who says that the Solomons have given an undertaking that this will not include a military base of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, Navy or Air Force in the Solomon Islands. But the wording of this agreement, which allows for capacity building in maintaining national security, is wide open. We know from the draft agreement that the two countries had in mind, at least in the draft stage, that the last clause of the draft said that this agreement could be expanded at any point on mutual consent. So once again, all we can really say is that the political will is there for the two countries to expand their logistical and political and national security engagement. We know what China's interests are, and the caveat, that the clause that is in all of these statements about being for mutual benefit and with the Solomons' consent, while it may be technically accurate, is also politically simply unrealistic. That, first of all, because of the mismatch of the size of the countries, but secondly, the degree of political dependency that Sogavare now has on China, because they provide the funding to the constituency fund, so-called, that the Solomons operates, from which the Prime Minister makes payments to members of Parliament in return for example, voting in support of him in the no-confidence motion which he faced in his Parliament last year. So there is a degree of dependency on China, which really makes them unequal partners in the so-called mutual benefit measurement.
Yeah. So the US was sending quite a significant delegation to Solomon Islands to try and talk them out of this agreement. This has now happened. Will it go ahead, and how critical is it that there is still negotiating from the Americans' point of view?
Well, I suppose the threshold point here is that if the US thought, if the Biden administration thought that the Australian government had the situation sufficiently under control, they would not be taking this measure. To have Kurt Campbell, who is shorthanded in the US media as Joe Biden's Indo-Pacific czar, to be leading a delegation from the State Department, the Pentagon, US aid and other agencies that will visit apparently not only the Solomon Islands but also Papua New Guinea and Fiji, tells us that the Biden administration thinks that we have reached a critical juncture in the struggle for control of the Indo-Pacific in the confrontation between the US and China. This is an expression of no confidence in the Australian ability to manage the situation. Recall that for many years the US has regarded, rightly or wrongly, but this is the US conception, that the South Pacific is an Australian equity within the US-Australia alliance, and that Australia could be trusted as the dominant power in the region to manage things for the benefit of the region, but also the US and Australia. The Kurt Campbell mission is an expression of no confidence, loss of confidence in the Australian ability to do that, and an attempt to get a more direct US engagement and management of the strategy and the strategic value of the region to deny China undue influence.
Yeah, and when you talk of the struggle for power in the Indo-Pacific, many Australians might say, well, what's all the fuss about this tiny Pacific nation? It's worth pointing out why it is raising so much concern in terms of historically.
Yes, well, we know that when the Japanese imperial forces were in the process of dominating all of the Asia-Pacific, that the point at which it reached the existential moment for Australia, and Australian freedom and liberty at least, was when the Japanese forces reached Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And the pivotal battles that were fought then, led by the US, but with heavy Australian casualties in PNG, and the Kokoda Trail is the most famous of those, but there were a number of battles in and around PNG, and in the Solomons. And the most famous is the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal is the main island constituting the Solomons Island group. And that was one of the pivotal battles of World War II in the Pacific. And the fact that the Allies won, gratefully, began the rollback of the Japanese Imperial Army, Navy and Air Force north back to the defeat of the Japanese in World War II. And the value of the Solomons and Guadalcanal in particular is that it straddles the maritime lifelines that connect Australia to the rest of the world, and particularly the US. But it's an essential so-called shipping line of communication, and whoever can control those maritime approaches controls trade access in and out of Australia. What Australia is able to import and export is at the whim of whoever controls that region. So that is why this is such a crucial part of the puzzle, just as it was in the 1940s. The geography hasn't changed. The Chinese government, of course, is keenly aware, which is why they put resources into cultivating the Solomons and other Pacific islands for years, why they will not relent, and they'll continue pressing for advantage, not only with political, but also with military gains in mind. We know that they've proposed dual use, meaning civilian, but also with military application bases in PNG, in Kiribati, Vanuatu, and the Solomons. And it looks like they're getting closer in the Solomons than anywhere else.
Yeah, and to that point, do you think that they not only could control trade, but in any military, significant international military conflict, control that as well, if they had this kind of leverage over nations like Solomons?
Absolutely. At the moment, the closest Chinese naval base to Australia is 6,000 kilometres to Australia's north. If the Chinese were able to build a naval base or military base in the Solomon Islands, that would bring it from 6,000 kilometres away to under 2,000 kilometres away. Still sounds like a long distance, but it's not, because we're talking about command of vast areas of ocean, vast areas of the planet. It's not a trivial matter that's exercised the Biden White House to take this very unusual step to bring a multi-agency task force to bear in talking to a number of the regional capitals. It represents, for Australia, this is a moment of strategic crisis that China's influence has been allowed to be brought to bear in national security, and that's using their own terms. That's the China-Solomon Islands Agreement. It talks about national security. It doesn't specify the security of which nation is involved here, but you have to assume that when China talks about national security, China is thinking about its own. This is a crisis that it has been able to bring unopposed, apparently, its national security, military, geopolitical ambitions and power to bear 4,000 kilometres closer to the Australian coastline, straddling a critical lifeline between Australia and the world.
Good to talk, Peter. Really interesting times. Thanks so much.
I wish it were a pleasure, Bev.